It's a sermon I've worked on a number of different times through the week, and I want to preach on personal revival. As I'm looking over everything, I know I've updated my slides a few times, including 7 o'clock this morning. And so my notes don't even match the slides. We're going to follow the slides, and I'll get my notes to get in line as they need to. But I want to preach on the idea of personal revival. I believe we often look at revival in a larger geographic mindset or idea. I think we would agree that our country needs revival. The answer for our country is not going to be at the next election. It's not going to be from a political party. It's not going to fix itself from Washington, D.C. The answer to our country is only something God will do miraculously as things happen from the pulpit and the pew down towards Washington, D.C. And so it's going to begin with revival. I think we look at revival as being something that happens in a church. We know churches or regions or communities or in the past countries that have had revival, that have seen the effect of revival. And we look for that, long for that, pray for that, and well, we should. That's extremely important. But as I come to the message today, I want to start with the idea of what it means to have personal revival. God brings revival on a large scale. In other words, we would hear perhaps an evangelist say when he comes to our church to visit or to preach, he'll say kind of a cliche statement. They often say, well, I don't bring revival in my suitcase or in my briefcase, right? We can't just miraculously make revival happen. We can't just make our church have revival. We just can't make our country have revival. It comes when God outpours something special upon us at a time when it's kind of out of our control. It's something that God does in a very miraculous way for us. Today, although, I want to look at the idea of what it means to have personal revival, because I believe, and listen, I don't believe this is often preached. I don't believe there's often many books written on this, but I believe personal revival is a lot to do with us getting us right. Amen. All right? We fix ourselves. We can have personal revival. I may be looking forward to, and I am, praying that God will pour out revival on our church, on our family, on our community, on Dillsburg, on our country. I hope and pray he does that. I don't have a lot of control over that. God does. I'm only responsible for me. But if I want to have personal revival in my life, I believe a lot of it has to do with me getting fixed what I'm supposed to get fixed. And if I fix what I'm supposed to fix, well, lo and behold, I'll have revival in my life. It has a lot to do with me fixing things, and the scripture is going to talk about that. I want to talk about first, though, what it means to have a great outpouring of revival, and I don't think I've looked at that enough. I don't think I've focused on that enough. So let's start there and then work our way back to a personal responsibility, because I think we'll see it in the story that I'm going to share. In the late 1940s, at the conclusion of the World War II era in Europe, there was a small island called the Hebrides Islands off of the coast of Scotland. On those islands, they were in a spot of spiritual decay. The folks noticed, in fact, we often hear this in America today, but the folks noticed that most of their churches had no young people, no kids. It was pretty much just some senior citizens going to churches on Sundays throughout the islands, throughout the denominations. It didn't matter. There was just nothing happening anymore, and there was some concern. There was some concern in particular in a lady's life by the name of Peggy Smith. Peggy was 84 years old. She had seen revival in her youth and was gravely concerned about her country today. But at 84 years of age, she lived with her sister, who helped take care of her, because Peggy was now blind and couldn't see. Peggy couldn't go to church anymore. She really didn't have any way to get there. And her sister, Christine, who looked after her, had severe arthritis. And so Peggy and Christine were homebound, but they had a burden for revival. They began to pray. They're like, there's nothing else we can do, but we can pray. And Peggy and Christine began to get things right in their life and began to have such a walk with God. Listen, this didn't happen in church. This happened in their living room. And for months, they began to pray, God, you've got to do something for our country. You've got to do something for our island. You've got to do something in our churches. And they contacted their local church that they had been part of and were still associated with. They contacted their pastor, and they said, God has laid on our heart that there's an evangelist working his way around Europe right now by the name of Duncan Campbell. You've got to contact Duncan Campbell. God's working in his life. You've got to figure out how to get Duncan Campbell to come to our little island. And the church put a great deal of responsibility and a lot of rapport had been built with these ladies, and they did not just brush that off. They did indeed send a letter to Duncan Campbell, would you come and preach on our island? And Duncan Campbell said, I would, but I'm busy, and I have commitments made. In fact, this summer when you wanted me to come, I'm already scheduled. So thank you for the opportunity, but I can't come. And so they went back and told Peggy and Christine, they're like, we contacted Duncan, but he's just not able to come. And they said, well, then you need to try again because he's coming. And the pastor and the deacons were puzzled by this. And they said, no, you don't understand. God's told us. Mr. Campbell's coming to preach here. You send him another letter. And they did. They sent another letter, another reply to Duncan Campbell. We just want to double check. Are you sure? And he wrote back and said, well, as it would be, the place I was going just canceled. He said, so since you've asked a couple of times, there must be something. I'm coming. I'll come. And he came and began to preach. And the churches on that island began to see revival in a great way. It was a revival that lasted in varying degrees for more than 30 years on that little island. By the end of 30 years, the churches were full. Young people had gotten saved and committed their lives to Christ. The churches were alive again with revival. Here's something that happens when revival hits a community like this. They could not find a bar any longer on the island of Hebrides. They had gone out of business. They had such transformed the church and such transformed the Christians that it was having a negative impact on sin and vice in the community. It was affecting everybody. So many people got saved, so many people gave their lives to Christ that crime was down, sin was down, alcoholism was down. All the things they'd been dealing with were gone for a season, for a period of time, as the church experienced revival. Listen, we would love to see, we need to see revival in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania. We need to see revival in Cedar Hill Baptist Church. We need to see revival in the United States of America. But revival came to this island because first revival came to Peggy and Christine, 84 years old. They had revival. And they didn't have revival because of some great evangelist. The evangelist came because of Peggy and Christine. They didn't have revival because of an amazing church service or their dynamic pastor, because they couldn't even get to church anymore because their health wouldn't allow it. They were shut in. They had revival because they got things right with God, because they had a close walk with the Almighty, because they spent time in fervent prayer. And so as I thought about that, I wrote down three things. I boiled this down to three things. I believe revival comes to our life when we work on three main areas: our relationship with God, our relationships with others, and our relationship to sin. Obviously, some of these need to grow, some of these need to get fixed, and some of these need to go away. Amen. Right? Relationship with God. I want to start with that for just a minute here this morning. Number one, how do we work on our relationship with God? John chapter 15. John chapter 15. I wrote down a lot of verses. We're going to look at a number of verses. I didn't necessarily pick a text. We're just going to look at a lot of different scripture today. and some of them we'll turn to, some of them we won't. But John chapter number 15 gives us some idea of a walk with God that we're supposed to have. It gives us a picture. Obviously, this is the passage talks about the true vine. John chapter 15, starting in verse number 1, Christ says, I'm the true vine, my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except you abide in me. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me ye can do nothing. John chapter 15 tells us of what our relationship is supposed to be with the true vine. Christ is the vine, God the Father as the husbandman, we are branches. We are branches that are supposed to abide in him. And so the first thing we need to work on in order to have revival in my life is my relationship with God. I have to be abiding. Scripture is full of verses like this. And again, if I can emphasize one thing throughout all these, it's this. Notice the responsibility that's on us, right? The great revival that came to that island came from the outpouring of God in a very special way. But it was because of two ladies that fixed themselves first. They got right with God first. There's a responsibility here on us. Look, draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. We sometimes sit there and go, I don't know, God doesn't seem very close. Well, there's a verse on that. Who needs to move? I do, right? Draw nigh to God, he draws nigh to you. Abide in me, come ye. Everyone that labors and is heavy laden, I will give you rest. Come. Draw. Be. Abide. Oh, how about walk in the light as he is in the light? There's verses on what we are supposed to do. And so if I can change one thing in our mindset is this. Lord, I am praying for your great outpouring of revival on my church, on my family, on my country. I am praying for a great movement that only you can bring. But Lord, I'm responsible for me today. And I can fix the things. I can't fix everybody out there. I can't. Even as your pastor, obviously, I can't change your relationship with God. But I can change my relationship with God. Amen. I can work on that. And while we have such an idea, Lord, someday bring out your hand of blessing upon our country, Lord, I don't need to worry about that in my life. I need to worry about fixing me in my life. There's things I need to deal with. I need to fix. I need to address. I need to put the effort in. You know why I'm not having revival? Because there's sin in my life. Because there's too much of me in my life. Me, myself, and I. The unholy trinity of self, right? We could get so consumed with me, with what I want, with how I feel, with what I want out of this and what this is doing for me. We don't have revival because there's too much of us in our lives, and our relationship with God is not what it should be. Number 2, I wrote down we need to work on our relationship with others. Our relationship with others. Every time there is great revival in a church, and I've been blessed enough to see this, especially years ago, for a period of time at my dad's church, experienced church-wide revival. And you know what was the first thing that happened when our church had church-wide revival? When the pastor was preaching, the evangelist came in and he was preaching, and people were starting to get under conviction and knew God was going to do something. The very first thing that happened, listen, was not that everyone got rid of their old dirty books or magazines. That will happen. That wasn't the first thing that happened. The first thing that happened was not that everyone said, you know what we need to do? We need to go soul winning. And that happens with revival. That wasn't the first thing that happened. The first thing that happened where families got up front and got things right in their family. People in the church got things right with each other. This person that didn't talk to that person met up front and hugged and cried, and the church cried with them and prayed with them. People got things right with each other. People who are walking around with anger and bitterness and resentment and things that hurts and things that have been carrying around for a long time. We had a family in our church that the dad had not talked to his adult daughter in 8-9 years. He hadn't seen his grandkids in 8-9 years because he wouldn't talk to his daughter. About the second week of revival, they both met right up front after the service. They cried, the church was crying, the evangelist was crying, everyone was crying. Because they got things right. They began to heal old wounds. They began to fix things in their lives. Listen, we're not going to have revival if things are not right between me and God. We're not going to have revival if things are not right between me and other people. I need to fix those things. I need to swallow my pride and say I'm sorry. Even if I don't feel like I did anything wrong. You ever been there? I didn't do anything. Number 3. I need to work on my relationship to sin. I need to deal with sin in my life. Most of that is pride, right? Pride's a big part of that. There's several layers of this, but pride's a big part of that. I need to deal with my pride. I need to deal with myself. I need to deal with how selfish I can be, getting what I want, doing what I want, when I want, how I want, all about me. We're more that way than we think we are. I wrote this down last night. It has nothing to do with this message. Well, I guess it does have to do with the message. I'm saying it. But I wrote this down last night on another subject altogether. You know what? We could look at the same situation and say 2 different things. One, I do everything around here, I'm not saying that about me. I'm just saying that in general, Tell me the husband or wife in your house has never at one time ever said, I do everything around here, I don't know what you do. I do it all. We say that sometimes. I do everything around here. How about a whole different approach is, I'm willing to do anything around here, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to get the job done, whatever it takes to move forward, whatever it takes to I'm willing to do anything. It's not whether or not I do everything. Prideful. I'm willing to do anything. Humble. They both might end up with us doing the same things. But our attitude is totally different between the two, aren't they? We're willing to do whatever it takes. The work, the effort, the sweat, the work that it takes to get things done? Or do we just need everybody to see what we did? Make sure they all know. Whole different perspective on the attitude there. There's so much that we need to deal with sin in our lives. Hebrews 12:1. Hebrews 12:1. Hebrews 12:1. I've used this verse a number of times lately as people ask about those that have gone before us, those people that are in heaven. Are they able to see what's going on? And we use this verse to define that. I believe they do. Hebrews 12:1, wherefore, seeing we are also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Let's stop right there. Listen, we put in, humans, we put in page numbers, chapter numbers, and verse numbers, right? This is an ongoing letter. Hebrews chapter 11, we call the what chapter? Faith chapter, right? It's the Hall of Fame of faith. It lists all of these great people, most of them from the Old Testament, that we've studied and learned about. Here they all listed in Hebrews chapter 11. So chapter 12, verse 1, wherefore, or because of all of these people, see, we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. In other words, they've gone on before us, and they're watching what we're doing now. They can see it. They have the ability to see what's going on now. That's the witnesses that are around, cheering us on, hoping for us. Obviously Christ is our intercessor, but they've gone on before us to watch us. Now, because of that, let us do what? Lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us. Every time there is revival, sin is affected. If there's revival in a church, sin gets dealt with. Talking to a pastor down in York County right now. Been talking to him a number of times. They started their 8th straight week of revival. Amen. 8th week, amen, starting today. They just concluded 7 straight weeks. Outside of the church, there's trash cans where people are dumping stuff. Literally dumping stuff. I remember seeing that when I was a kid. I haven't seen that for 30 years. I guess we don't have sin anymore, right? Oh, no, that's right. Our sin now is all digital. We can just hit delete on our phone and our sin goes away, right? We deal with it now. Because when I was a kid, people were dropping off their raunchy music and books and magazines and things they shouldn't have and bad stuff and bad games and we were dumping stuff. And am I the only one that went to camp or something and did that? You know, I mean, we saw that. Revival is spreading through a church in York right now, and you know what? People are throwing away junk. Amen. Throwing away stuff. Amen. Getting rid of stuff. We begin to deal with sin. The Bible tells us, lay aside the sin that doth so easily beset us. We want to have revival, we have to deal with the sin. We have to deal with the sin. We have to deal with the sin in my life, whatever it is. Each one of us, we know what it is. That thing that trips us up, that thing that catches us every time. Maybe it's our pride. Maybe it's our selfishness. Maybe it's a vice. You know, maybe it's a prescription painkiller. We know it's starting to have a hold on us. Or the alcohol. Or the drugs. You know what? Sometimes, I don't preach on those a lot. We have this wonderful idea, this false utopian sense that we're in church, so we don't have to worry too much about drugs, alcohol. Yes, we do. Amen. Yes, we do. Maybe it's the drugs, maybe it's the alcohol, maybe it's the pornography, maybe it's the relationship that you shouldn't have outside of your marriage. There are things that we need to deal with. We know what it is. We know what's tripping us up. We know what's catching us. We know what Satan's using to keep us a defeated Christian. Lay aside the sin that does so easily beset us. We want to have revival. I think we can boil it down to dealing with 3 areas of our lives. I think I need to work on my relationship with God. I think I need to fix my relationship with others. And I think I need to deal with the sin that's in my life. If I did that, if we did that, if we had 6 or 8 or 10 people in Cedar Hill Baptist Church that walked with God the way we're supposed to, that loved others and had a great relationship with others like we're supposed to, and had dealt with the sin in our life, we would have 8 to 10 people in our church with personal revival. And if you have 8 or 10 people in a church with personal revival, that church would have revival. We had 2 little old ladies, 84 years old, that couldn't leave their house, that prayed in revival for their country. We could have revival in our church if we work on us. Work on me. These are some verses I used when I preached this message a year ago. And let me just run down through some. Some of them I've already mentioned. But on each of these that I've listed here, there's about a dozen. I'm just going to read part of a verse, and then we'll pray and close. But on each of these, the Scripture puts the onus on us to take some action. All right? Walk in the light as He is in the light. How about Proverbs 3:6? In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Put on, therefore, the whole armor of God. We have to put it on. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Lay aside every weight and sin. We just read that in Hebrews chapter number 12. Come unto me, I will give you rest. How about dealing with relationships? Be ye tenderhearted, forgiving one another. Number 9 on my list is from John 15, later down the passage we were just reading, which tells us to love one another. Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, I guarantee you have this written on a plaque, a mug, a bookmark. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. Pray without ceasing. Go into all the world. All these require some action on our part, things for us to fix, things for us to work on. I'm serious. I'm convinced that we have become such a mindset that, well, God, I'm just waiting for you to bring revival. And God says, I'm waiting for you, individually, you, to fix some things in your life, to get it right. I gave you a list of things to work on. You haven't done it. Why do we think God's going to bring revival to Washington, D.C., if we're not willing to fix some things in our own lives, to see a revival in my life and in your life? I want revival to be personal in our lives. Let's pray.